Okay, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you're suitably refreshed after lunch. Today, this afternoon's session really is the as much as anything about launching our report and going into the research that we have done as a research institute on this question. About 18 months ago, we identified this as a research priority for us. And with the support of our colleagues in the Community Security Trust and the Swedish National Defence College, we identified an aspect, because there are many aspects of far-right extremism, that we thought was worthy of further scrutiny, and that is, in particular, the nexus, if you like, between the British far-right and similar-minded groups in Scandinavia. And we have representatives both of ICSR itself and of the Swedish National Defence College here who work together on the project. And the project's two authors are Alexander Meleagrou-Hitchens, who's a senior research fellow at ICSR, my PhD student as well, and Hans Brun, another of my PhD students, attached to the Swedish National Defence College, where he's also a research fellow and lecturer. So I'm going to hand over to each speaker, who's going to summarise the report for 10 minutes each, and then open it up for questions. We have 45 minutes, so I'll ask the speakers to keep it relatively brief, because I'm sure there'll be lots of questions.
Thanks, John. To just say, very quickly, the report itself is based on a few months, maybe half a year of fieldwork and interviews with members of these Defence League Counter-Jihad groups, both in Scandinavia and the UK. It is another report to give you information on the sort of lower strata of the movement. It's more about the leadership and intellectual background and history of the movement, rather than trying to give any indication about that street element of it. The report itself has got three overall aims. First, to provide an overview of the European network, which the counter-jihad movement is currently building, based on the framework provided by the EDL. The report tracks the emergence of defense leagues, which we have labeled collectively as the European Counter-Jihad Movement, ECJM for short, so that will be, you'll see that acronym during the slides. Secondly, we want to provide an in-depth analysis of the movement ideology based both on the review of their own output, again this is based on their leadership output on their main websites, and interviews with leading members and people from the events we attended. And finally, we're going to look at these sort of types of tactics and themes the movement used to recruit and mobilize followers. I'm going to briefly touch on all these in about the 10 minutes I have. It's worth mentioning here that since the emergence of the ECJM, or even of the EDL, it has garnered support from prominent figures in the United States, including counter-jihad activists like Pamela Geller and Robert Spencer, who've praised the emergence of the group and of defense leagues in particular, and are really assisting at the moment in organizing a sort of a coherent and pan-European movement. In the last year, the EDL has made a concerted effort, therefore, to spread the defense league concept throughout Europe, using both online networking and organized on-the-ground demonstrations. The EDL has inspired the creation of a number of other defense leagues around Europe, with specific focus on Scandinavia. As a result of this organizational drive, the last years have seen the emergence of defense leagues in countries such as Finland, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and a few others. Tommy Robinson, EDL leader, from our experience speaking to people at the gatherings I'll discuss later, in Europe, is sort of got quite a high sort of legendary status with these guys, seen as a bit of a rock star. He's just got out of prison now, he's got that sort of martyrdom element with him as well. What does counter-jihad refer to? Very briefly, it's a self-described movement. That's what they call themselves. Not a great term. We use it now really just for ease of reference. We've identified it really as a loose collection of European and American activists and politicians. We've identified Islam and Muslims in the West as an existential threat. They come in many different forms, from political parties to street protest pressure groups and blogs. This report will focus on the latter ones and their immediate allies, the EDL mainly. We've identified the ECJM essentially as a loosely organized and decentralized network of sympathetic groups and political parties that use the internet to coalesce into a more effective international anti-Islam and anti-Muslim movement. Recently, what we've seen as part of that organizational drive is the establishment of international umbrella organizations that are admittedly quite small, one of them called Stop the Islamization of Nations, which includes sort of all the new defense leagues and some of their other allies in America. These alliances are also being officially consolidated online through a defense league umbrella group called the European Freedom Initiative, founded by Robinson and former EDL media head Steve Simmons. According to Robinson, in an interview I did with him last year, through the EFI, all the defense leagues stay in touch and talk every day. So they try to build up this sort of network. And a number of the Scandinavian defense league sites, if you go on them, for example, employ almost the exact same design, or actually the exact same design, and are run by the same EFI administrator. So we can see at least a concerted effort to do that. Moving on to the meetings that we both attended, really these two umbrella groups I've just mentioned have organized a number of meetings in Europe in an effort to sort of shift more of the movement's activism from the virtual to the physical world. The most recent of these were in Aarhus, Denmark, and in Stockholm a few months later. The first was in March, Aarhus, and Stockholm was in August. The Aarhus meeting really marked the first gathering of this budding alliance and ushered in a new phase of ECJM's development. It was made up of Defense League members from Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, England, and Germany, and it was a statement of unity which, according to Tommy Robinson, would give birth to a new era of standing up against the Islamization of Europe. Now, very small attendance, these meetings, maybe maximum 100 people, maybe even lower. And the event was actually really kind of derided as a failure and a damn squib, and in that sense it was. But I think at that time, a lot of people ignored the sort of strategic intent, what they were at least trying to do. Despite this low attendance, therefore, these first actual meetings demonstrated the movement's desire to branch out from the online activism again and establish a physical presence throughout Europe. And it really inaugurated a union among like-minded counter-jihad groups in Europe and America that would now attempt to act strategically as a sort of coordinated body. Moving on to the ideology very briefly, there's a lot to say about it, but I'll just try and pick out some of the main points. So its activism really is inspired by an ideology which presents the current jihadist threat to the West as really a part of a centuries-long effort by Muslims, by Islam and Muslims to dominate Western civilization. Crucially, it argues that Islam isn't just a religion, but a political, a supremacist and violent political ideology. It also holds that there is a conspiracy currently underway to Islamize Europe through the stealthy implementation of Sharia law, and that many of Europe's Muslims are currently engaged in this through a variety of means. The actions of Muslims in the West, you'll find, are very often viewed solely through this frame alone, and proof of Islamization is really seen everywhere by the movement. From the availability of halal meat to the rape of non-Western women by Muslim men. The other main collaborators in this conspiracy are apparently a European liberal elite who are refusing to resist this onslaught, either through fear or a desire to benefit from the chaos. There's an apparently genuine belief in the movement that this process is not stopped, and by some people believe it's not stopped violently. Now, then Europe will face a civil war and eventually become part of a new caliphate run by Sharia law. Islamization is a term you'll hear about a lot. You know, what do they really mean by it? It's really one of the dominant themes of their rhetoric and on their website. Of the website of one of the ECJM groups, Stop the Islamization of Europe, SIOE, you have the full quote there, but they describe the problem as the process by which the supremacy of Islam is taking place by whatever means Muslims and their allies use. Together with our own establishment, they suppress our free speech and stealthily introduce Sharia law. An article of a very popular ECJM blog, Gates of Vienna, entitled "What is Islamization?" The author also offers a description. He says that the word Islamization was actually originally coined by Muslims, supposedly, and that is a phenomenon that has existed since the foundation of the religion. The article concludes that Islamization is carried out through, and I quote, the elimination of the indigenous culture, introduction of Islamic traditions, and immigration. Another key theme for the ideology is the ideas of Sharia and Taqiyya, which many of you probably have come across. And so the threat of Islam really in the West for the ECJM is manifested through the desire to replace Western liberal democracy with what the ECJM defines as Sharia law. According to the ideology, the process of Islamization will culminate in the imposition of Sharia. And the ECJM argues that the strict Sharia imposed in countries like Saudi Arabia or by extremist groups like the Taliban are actually integral to Islam, and that Muslims are duty bound to live by it and impose it wherever they reside. Now this really does stem from what could fairly be described as an essentialist view of Islam, Muslims, and Sharia, which does not allow for more liberal interpretations of the religion. Any attempt, in fact, to achieve this are rejected by the ECJM as a misinterpretation or a deliberate and sinister masking of the truth. The project of imposing Sharia gradually in the West by a surreptitious step-by-step process is often referred to by the ECJM as creeping Sharia or stealth jihad, terms that I'm sure many of you follow are very familiar with. A Muslim's sort of dissembling of his or her true beliefs and the patient deference to such a process, the widespread habit, according to ECJM theory, is referred to as taqiyya, itself an ancient Islamic term roughly translating to religious dissimulation, whereby a Muslim can deny all or parts of their faith if it is to the overall benefit of Islam. It's worth noting, as I mentioned before, that the attempt to present this issue as one that has existed since the foundation of Islam, you can see that when they use terms that are ancient Islamic terms, in an attempt to create that connection and sort of present the current problem as really stemming from that original foundation. So obviously, therefore, Sharia is interpreted as an attack on liberal enlightenment values, and this allows the ECJM to essentially present itself as the protector of values such as freedom of speech and democracy. The creeping Sharia theme was actually very prevalent at the meetings we attended, and one of the quotes, I believe, is here from the head of the Finnish Defense League, Mimosa Korinen, I believe is the right pronunciation. Korinen. And you can see here again, it is one of the sort of central concerns is sort of the imposition of Sharia into democracy, and how it is the thin end of the wedge to much bigger problems. Another key concern of theirs is essentially belief in a coming civil war, so the prediction of an imminent civil war in Europe to be fought between indigenous Europeans and the descendants of Muslim immigrants. Robinson, in an interview, was very worried about this. He genuinely believed that it was coming within 50 to 100 years due to issues such as demographics and others. He thought that there was no doubt in his mind, and tends to be the case in a lot of these followers, is that there is a coming war, and if we don't do something about it now, it's just going to be worse. It was echoed constantly at the event we attended as well. Worth noting, Breivik was very, very keen on this war. He's a very strong believer in it taking place, and he believed it was actually already underway in England and France, and he saw himself he saw the attacks as a legitimate action during the Civil War, in which enemies were not only Muslim immigrants, but the liberal left elite he believed to be complicit in the destruction of his culture. Clearly, the concept of an actual military war is always one that, by its very nature, encourages violence, and this type of rhetoric from the ECJM may play some role in inspiring others like Breivik, who will cast themselves as soldiers in this war and attempt violent acts in its name. Finally, very quickly on one of the key mobilization themes that they've been using a lot recently, the stories about the sex grooming gangs in north of England, the Asian gangs. At one of their gatherings, again in Aarhus, there's a quote there. One of the, I believe it was a Swedish Defense League member, was very concerned about this issue during his speech, and he essentially says here, I don't know if that statistic is correct, but his claim here that 100% of rape cases in Oslo are done by Muslim immigrants. Sexual assaults perpetrated by Muslims against Western females are really presented and seen by many within the ECJM as a sort of inevitable byproduct of Muslim integration and resultant Islamization. And the evidence of the barbarity of Islam and Muslims and their disdain for sort of Western culture and values. A number of defense leagues in Europe have used cases or merely the concept of the rape of indigenous women by Muslim immigrants as a very powerful mobilizing message, often presenting it as a deliberate and coordinated tactic within the wider conspiracy and a specifically Islamic phenomenon. This sort of what they coined the term rape jihad as it's come to be known, is a significant concern for the EDL particularly, and interest has risen since revelations in the British media about the existence of sex grooming gangs made up of Muslim men of South Asian origin. In June 2012, the EDL staged a demonstration in Rochdale, and their main aim, according to the official promotional video, was, and I believe the quote is there, was to pressure the police and the media to refer specifically to the gang members as Muslim, so that a causal link between the religion and the crime could be inferred. The text accompanying the video proclaims that they have to stop this pathetic labeling of these pedophilic gangs as Asian males. These men are Muslims. Worth noting, this article is written by someone who claimed to be an Asian themselves, who disliked Muslims and didn't like the fact that all Asians were being sort of put together and considered Muslims. So again, we've seen here an attempt to make this into a civilizational Islam versus the West issue, and pushing this narrative is really one of their main goals. And at that, I will hand over to Hans.
Yep, thanks.
Thank you.
Yep, I'm going to talk about the European Counter-Jihad universe. And as we see it, it's built up with three different strains. The first one is classical extreme right and neo-Nazis. The second one is made up of populistic right-wing parties. Most of them have started as being a libertarian anti-taxation parties in different countries, and have slightly shifted their focus. And the third strain is Islamophobes. Some of them are against Muslims per se, others are just opposed to Islamization as an ideology. It's a bit different. They use an organizational model called a decentralized distributed network. This is an old idea from the United States from the beginning of the 1960s, when they did research on how to maintain communications during nuclear warfare. This system has no command center. It's supposed to be extremely difficult to knock out. And the reasons? Well, you see the reasons. One, the political elite in the West has betrayed us. They are after us. Two, the extreme left will attack us. They are dangerous. Three, the Muslims are even more dangerous. So we have to have this sort of organization to survive. And the network is built up by defense leagues. There are about 22 of them in Europe, Australia, and Northern America. It's made up of the parties I mentioned, basically libertarian parties. You have them in Belgium, Holland, Scandinavia, right now in about 11 countries in Europe, according to themselves. It is also made up of different organizations, such as Stop the Islamization of Nations. It is also made up of, of individuals. And this is extremely interesting, I think, because in this network, you don't have to have a big organization behind you to make an impact. Some of the most important people here are just individuals who have nothing behind them. All they have is an internet connection. And different websites, such as Gates of Vienna. Sort of collective blogs. We'll start with the websites. Gates of Vienna is about 7 years old. It was started by an American who was inspired by the Swift boat attack on John Kerry. Atlas Shrugs, Pamela Geller in the United States, most known for the Ground Zero debate, the mosque at Ground Zero, and the idea that President Obama is a Muslim from Kenya. Tundra Tabloids, that is a Finnish blog actually. Also discuss different issues regarding this. Tryckfrihet, that is a Swedish word for the right to write and speak freely. That is made up of slightly older people in their 50s and 60s with good careers behind them, and they are using the human rights aspect of this. We have to discuss it. The right to speak freely is under pressure, and this is important. And then we have the International Civil Liberties Alliance. That group is probably the most important one, I would say. That group gathers the elite within this universe. We'll get to that. The defense leagues, I've discussed that. What I'm going to focus on here is the 9-10 group that was started by the Gates of Vienna. And take a good look at those two pictures. What you see here is the first one, the 9-10 group, with the phoenix rising from the World Trade Center in New York, with the words rebirth, resistance. Rebirth is about getting over the trauma of 9/11. Resistance, well, the West is under attack. We must fight back. If you look at the next picture, you'll see the network. There is no command center. What they do have in the center is the phoenix. This Civil Liberties Alliance has just removed the phoenix from the logo. And the reason is that they sort of realized that there are two organizations who have used the phoenix recently. And that is the IRA and the CIA. The CIA had something called the Phoenix Program during the Vietnam War that is quite controversial. And they didn't want to be associated with the IRA, so they took away the Phoenix. Political parties, I'm going to discuss Scandinavia here, put a bit of context to it. In Sweden we have Sverigedemokraterna, or the Sweden Democrats. They are former hardcore Nazis. They are in the parliament. They have about 5% of the vote right now. We think they are going to get between 10 and 20% in the next election, that is next year. In Norway, we have Fremskrittspartiet, the Progressive Party. They have about 22% of the vote already. In Denmark, you have Dansk Folkeparti, Danish People's Party, also very important. And in Finland, you have the True Finns, San Finländarna, who have close to 20%. This is, I think, one of the key issues here. Most people within this movement are not interested in a street fight with their opponents. They want to become mainstream. They want to get into the parliament and change the system from within. Context is everything. Individuals. We mentioned Fjordman a while ago. Fjordman is a Norwegian. That's a pseudonym, his alias. Breivik was extremely inspired by Fjordman. And Fjordman often discusses the right to use self-defense against the Muslims. We're not going to attack them, but when they do, we will strike back with force. Kent Ekeroth, number 2, that is the man to the left. He is in the parliament for the Sweden Democrats in Sweden, in a former Nazi party, and he's half Jewish. His mother is from Poland. He's extremely talented, very skilled politician. And that illustrates how this movement changes over time. He's pro-Israel, publicly. Discusses how Israel is attacked by not the PLO, but by the Muslims. And then you have Anders Gravers, who is Danish, who is behind Stop Islamization of Nations and Stop Islamization of Europe, a key member. They play a very big role in this. So, anyway, questions?
Yeah, we'll open it up to questions. If I may start actually with the nature of the research. Alex, you interviewed Tommy Robinson.
Mm-hmm.
What given the nature of the report, what was his attitude to research of this type of nature? Was he happy to be on the record to speak, to come across as plausible, or was he suspicious of the whole thrust and direction of the research?
What you noticed with Robinson when the EDL was first forming, when it was having problems with having a huge presence of neo-Nazis in their marches and not getting a very coherent message out about them being very Islam focused. The emergence of Robinson as a leader was part of that attempt to move away from the neo-Nazism and to come up with a coherent message. And they did that by making Robinson into a fairly accessible figure for researchers and for media, and therefore you see him quoted all over the place. He does TV. He's very accessible, and that's part of their mission, their rebranding drive to create a softer image of the media and something that's not the same as the National Front, something that's not the same as the BNP. So he was fairly open, and I spoke to him on the phone a few times after to confirm a few other things that were going on, and he was for a researcher, he was one of the sort of ideal in that sense, because he was sort of an extremist leader who was very happy to talk, and he didn't mind if he didn't trust you. He didn't seem to mind if you're going to attack him. Maybe now that he's out of prison, he's going to be more cautious. I don't know.
Okay, let me open it up to the audience. There's plenty to chew on there. There's a question. I can see a hand made up there immediately. If we can just go ahead.
Yeah, I kind of had a question about.
Can we just name an organisation?
My name is Joe Mulhall. I'm a PhD student looking at post-war far-right, but I've also worked for Hope on and off for about 4 years. I kind of had a question about the size. You mentioned at the beginning about differentiating between the kind of rank and file and perhaps some of the ideologues. And I think if you look at the English Defence League at its peak, when it had around, say, 3,000 people at demonstrations in places like Luton and Bradford, and it was a very broad church of people turning up, everything from racial nationalists, former CAT members, right through to people who just thought that radical Islam was an issue.
Yeah.
And over time, we've seen most of these people drop away. Lots of the moderate people found it too extreme, and some of the other ones realised this wasn't going to be a vehicle for them. And we've seen that a lot of the splinter groups from groups such as the EDL have fallen into line with what you might call the traditional right, infidels falling in behind the National Front, etc. So even now with just the remnants of, say, the EDL, you have a mix between those who are ideological in the way you discuss and people who just don't like Muslims. So in terms of this ideological core that you're talking about, what sort of size do you put on it? And how influential do you think these ideas are? If you go to demos, how many people do you think have read Eurabia? I would say very small. So how influential are some of these more ideological ideas on the wider movement?
Well, the point about Eurabia is a good one. Not many people have read Eurabia. Many people believe the ideas presented in it because they've been transmitted by these blogs, by these individuals. The numbers, very odd. I mean, I wouldn't want to put a number on it because I simply don't know. It's not very big. But Matt has spoken before about the downfall of the ideologies, and I think I agree. I mean, but it might collapse as a street movement. But as that sort of beacon for providing an easily sort of consumable anti-Islam message, it's going to continue. And this alliance we're talking about is going to continue producing those materials, perhaps mostly online, and with this attempt to create that physical presence, which is, I think, going to dwindle most likely. But I think the core of this Islamization obsession, what we've seen and what we see at the marches with, we see other sort of racial minorities at these marches sometimes, is that it does transcend race and religion and things like that. Well, not all religions, but it transcends a lot of things that previous far-right ideologies didn't. And for that reason, I think it's the hold that it has on European politics and European thought is already strong enough and you're seeing it being taken up by the political parties that Hans mentioned. So you can talk about that a bit more.
I think we have to look at it from a country-to-country perspective because it takes different types of expression in different countries. I don't think that you're going to have them in the parliament in the UK for a number of reasons, but you will see a change in Scandinavia definitely.
You don't have proportional representation.
No, exactly. That's one reason.
Until the Liberals get at it.
Question here, and then I'll come to you.
If you combine the two presentations, I mean, is it possible that people on the far right in this country will, I mean, you're assuming that there are people who are more extreme than a lot of the people that are in these popular tax, anti-tax parties, and they have some relationship to them or influence. Is it possible that people on the far right here will, create a kind of entryist policy into UKIP. I mean, UKIP would be, to some extent, I don't need lawyers here from UKIP, are the functional equivalent of those kinds of parties, which are not fascist parties, but they blend things that are conservative and otherwise in a weird mix. The libertarian aspect there obviously is common to UKIP as well. So you've got that. So I'm wondering if you have an entryist strategy going on, like Trotskyite to the Labour Party or something years ago.
You mean a coherent way? I mean an intentional
coherent
one?
policy. And I have one other question about Sharia Democratica. Are you getting a lot of people from the Swedish Social Democrats?
Yes.
Former voters, working class voters?
What's happening now, you have a political chicken race in Sweden.
Yeah.
Everyone is seeing that the Sweden Democrats are getting the vote.
Yeah.
And they are discussing immigration, especially
Yeah.
Muslim immigration. And we're just waiting to see who's going to pick up this, Labour or the Conservatives.
Right.
It's going to happen. It's a chicken race.
Right.
They will pick it up, believe me. Some of them will.
And I mean, on the that coherent interest, I don't think so. But I do. I mean, the UKIP has sort of dabbled in the Islam in Europe debate, and they do lean towards a lot of stuff I was discussing. But I don't think there's any. And I think again, UKIP their main concern is Europe, and with EDL guys, their main concern is Islam in Europe and getting rid of it. So they're not going to want to distract themselves too much.
Right.
Yeah, gentleman here, and then back to you. Yeah.
Okay, Emmanuel Godin from the University of Portsmouth. I think that what is interesting in the title, you don't use the word right wing, or far right. And this is probably very wise because Islamophobia is not necessarily only associated with the right. There are some groups on the left, what I know a bit about, which are now very attracted to that sort of mobilization, which previously were a section of the gay community out of Islamophobia, section of the Jewish community, but also a section of traditional social democratic party for a variety of reasons, could be economic or identity. So I wonder, in the Scandinavian context or in the British context, is it possible to identify if there have been some transfer from the left into this sort of organization?
Well, like I said before, it has a transcendental quality. This Islam obsession, and that again transcends also political affiliation. There were guys we spoke to in Norway, wasn't it? In Aarhus, who claimed, I couldn't back it up, but NDL members who claimed they were Green Party members.
I think it's true. Actually.
And I mean, it doesn't surprise me. It wouldn't surprise me. And it's worth noting that the gatherings they have in Europe, as these sort of joint defensive gatherings, and the ones that say the EDL has here, the attendance is very, very different. So the kind of guys who are attended Manchester last weekend, the EDL rally, are not the kind of guys who can take a weekend break to Denmark. And so there you actually get that sort of, for want of a better term, that sort of upper echelon of these followers who are the sort of more intellectual and sort of more sort of well read, or whatever. The guys who would have may have read a lot of the texts that are often referred to but never fully analyzed. So I think there has been a transfer, and that's what gives it that quality that perhaps others didn't have. And you mentioned the far right. I mean, we don't use the term far right in the title, and there is a reason. But we do have there's a fairly laborious discussion in the report about sort of categorizing them. You're free to skip over that, but really what we sort of say is that, and we try and come up with a decent way of defining them. What we did come up with, and open to criticism, is cultural ultra nationalists. But and yes, they are far right in the sense that they're looking to overturn or implement rather very authoritarian measures like banning mosque construction, things like that, and not just certain mosques, but just ban a blanket ban of mosque building in Europe, for example, which is not that's something that is more associated with the far right thought and the sort of just authoritarianism that exists, the streak of authoritarianism that exists in all of them. If you ask them what policies would they want, they certainly would be right wing and far right wing. Definitely. Yeah.
We'll take another question in the lady behind. Yeah. Thanks.
My name is Vidya Ramalingam from the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, and I'm wondering, when you set out the European Counter-Jihad movement, you set out three categories. It was traditional right-wing extremists, populist radical right and Islamophobes, and I'm wondering how justifiable it is to keep traditional right-wing extremists in that category.
Because some of them are.
But no, I understand that. But if we're talking about traditional right-wing extremism as Combat 18, straight through, National Socialist Underground, straight through to BNP and National Front, perhaps that's based on some of our conversations earlier this morning. I mean, these groups wouldn't necessarily consider themselves as to be part of the broader Counter-Jihad movement or the kind of anti-Islamization movement. And I understand that some groups do very and quite opportunistically shift from right-wing extremist subcultures like the Sweden Democrats onto the anti-Islam platform. But in some ways, that's a very difficult and long transition. I mean, it took the Sweden Democrats 20 years essentially to make that transition. So how justifiable is it to actually put these in traditional right-wing extremism?
Because it's still there. If you look at this member of parliament, Kent Ekerup, that I showed, he's being criticized still within his party for being Jewish.
Yeah.
So you have this sort of old idea still being there. They're trying to polish it away, put it aside, but it's still there.
The Sweden Democrat, my main question is the Sweden Democrats seem to be a quite different party than the other Scandinavian options.
Oh yeah.
So they seem to be an exception almost that they're a great role model for right-wing extremist organizations that want to move into the mainstream.
I mean, they had people in the 1990s that fought with the Waffen-SS in the war by own choice.
I think you've got to recognise that half Jewish doesn't actually mean anything. You're either Jewish
for
or
the
you're
Nazis,
not Jewish.
For the Nazis it does.
Yes, but not on the other way around.
I know.
And I mean, I think the alliance that the EDL has with the British Freedom Party might comes close to answering that question. I think British Freedom, Matt probably knows better than me about them, but oh yeah. So I mean, they're not they're a bit of a joke of a party themselves, and the alliance was opportunistic. But the point is that they did see an affinity with each other. And I mean, Paul Weston, the head of British Freedom, was a BNP member, and it's questions about exactly what he believes. But I think that alliance alone shows that it's worth taking into account that there is a traditional far-right element to some of this stuff. And I think, that British Freedom Alliance is maybe one example of that.
Well, once again, context is everything. You have to look at each country, each organization, each person to do the right kind of judgment. And I think you and I have the same sort of opinion on this, actually.
We'll take one more question before we break. Yeah.
From the Henry Jackson Society. I've been doing stuff on national culture stuff in university, heard of them. And I was wondering if you had any evidence of university-based groups kind of attempting to push the far-right message, and particularly the Counter-Jihad message out to students on campuses. So, for example, this group were encouraging students to go along to EDL demonstrations. So I was wondering if that had happened in Europe anywhere at all.
I mean, I've heard. You go on.
No,
I've heard of some. I don't know if they were officially. I don't think they were official societies, but I have heard of EDL societies in some London universities. I've been told of, sort of people trying to recruit about, even like small stuff, like sort of anti-Muslim graffiti written in the bathrooms of student unions and stuff by people claiming to be EDL. So I think there is definitely an EDL, or at least some sort of EDL sympathetic presence, but I don't think it's that organized that I know of, but I don't really know more than that.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've got 15 minutes for coffee before the afternoon session, and we'll finish up there. I just sum up by saying, not only read the report, read the laborious bit on definition as well, because it's actually quite important as to how we situate this. And one crucial thing in the report, I think, that Alex and Hans didn't get to talk about, is the difference between the rationality and the plausibility of a lot of these narratives, and then what they saw on the ground at demonstrations and what translates as street politics. I think that's an important theme we might develop in the afternoon. But I'd say we've got 15 minutes for coffee, and then we'll have the next session.